In this video, I want to discuss two key passages that eternal security advocates use to support their once saved, always saved doctrine. The first one is Philippians 1 verse 6, where it says, "He who began a good work in you will finish it." I want to look at that text in its context. And the second one is 1 John 2:19, where it says, "They went out from us because they were not of us." I want to look at those two passages in their context so we can see whether or not they really support the once saved, always saved doctrine. But let's begin with Philippians 1 verse 6. And I want to begin reading from verse 3. Now it's important as I begin to read that you notice that the sentence for verse 6 begins in verse 4. So we can read from 3 through to 6 to get a bit of context for the passage, but bear in mind that verse 4 is where the sentence actually begins. And what we read is this: "I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus." Now, one sentence from verse 4 to verse 6, very important. Verse 5 tells us that he is always praying for them with joy because of their partnership in the gospel. That is an important key word. What does he mean by partnership? Is he just talking about them all being saved, or is there something more to it? The partnership here being discussed is their gift to the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul received a gift, many gifts actually, from the Philippian church, but this letter was occasioned by a recent gift that they had given him. And this is what Paul means when he says that they had a partnership with him in the gospel. And when it says he who began a good work in you, the good work is that gift that they had given to the Apostle Paul. Now, if we see that in the context, what we read is this, that the good work of this gift, which God began in the Philippians, would continue. God would continue to perfect that until Jesus Christ returns. And we here today are still benefiting from that gift, not only because it enabled Paul to spread the gospel, but because it also occasioned this epistle that we benefit from today. So this good work that was begun in the Philippian church, the context is not their salvation. He hasn't even begun to discuss their salvation. The context is their partnership in the gospel. If we look in chapter 4, we see that this same Greek word translated as partnership is used in chapter 4 verse 15, and we read this: "Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, no one church shared," and the word there is the same Greek word as partnered. "No one church partnered with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need." So it's clear that the partnership is the gift, and this is the good work that God has begun. It's not talking about salvation, but even if it was, putting aside the interpretation I've given you, even if it was talking about salvation, which it clearly isn't, but even if it was, he's just saying he is confident in the case of the Philippians that he who began a good work in them would complete it. So if it was talking about salvation, it's just Paul expressing his confidence in relation to these Philippians. We don't see the same confidence being used when Paul writes to the Galatians in chapter 5. Let's look quickly. Galatians chapter 5. In verse 2 it says, Paul says this to the Galatian church: "Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace." So Paul doesn't express the same confidence that he did for the Philippians to this Galatian church. So it's not a universally applied passage that we can say there's a promise in the Bible that he who began a good work in you will finish it. That's just not what the text is saying in the book of Philippians. The next passage I want to look at is 1 John chapter 2:19. But I want to begin in verse 18 so we can get the context. Let me read to you verses 18 and 19 and then we can begin to discuss them. Verse 18, little children, it is the last time, and as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us. But they went out that they might be made manifest that they were not all of us. So let's look at this in context. First of all, we can see that John is not trying to teach us about the general believer. He's dealing with the topic of antichrists, people who are false teachers coming into the midst of the church. So it's not a general teaching about believers and whether or not they can fall away. It's something dealing with Antichrist. So any implication we can take from this verse is a secondary meaning and not the primary meaning. So it's not a good text to prove a particular doctrine if it's not really addressing that doctrine. But let's continue to look in verse 19. They went out from us, but they were not of us. Now the Eternal Security Advocate would like to read it this way. They went out from us, but they were never of us. That's how the Eternal Security Advocate likes to read this, but that is not what is taking place here. John is talking about people that have left them in a particular point of time, and he's saying that when they left us, they weren't of us. That's all he's saying. He's saying when they left, these people left us, but they weren't of us. It doesn't mean they were never of us, it just means that when they left, they weren't of us. For if they had been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us. Now the Eternal Security Advocate will again argue, if they had ever been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us forever. That's how the Eternal Security Advocate wants to read this verse, but that's not what it says. All it says is that if they had been of us, at that point that they left, then they would have no doubt continued with us instead of departing from us. Doesn't that make sense? You know, if somebody was truly a believer, instead of leaving us at that time, they would have stayed with us. Doesn't mean that John is saying they would stay with us forever. It's just saying that instead of leaving us at that time, if they were of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out that it might be made manifest that they were not all of us. It doesn't say that they went out that it might be made manifest that they were never of us. All it's saying is that they went out from us so that it might be clear that at that time, the time they left, they were not of us. All this text is saying is that these false teachers that left the company of believers did so because at that time they were not really Christians at that time. Doesn't mean they were never Christians. They may have been, they may not have been. But we know for sure that at this time they were not really Christians. Because if they were truly Christians, then instead of leaving us at that moment, they would have continued in fellowship with us. But because they left us at that time, it proved that at that time they were not really of us. That passage just does not teach eternal security. And I think it's pretty clear if we just read it plainly and simply without importing into it the words ever, never or forever, we just get a very simple, plain reading of the text. And we shouldn't use this passage that even if somehow it could be construed as saying that you can't lose your salvation, we shouldn't read an unclear text in a way that contradicts other clear texts. We should always read these vague kind of texts in light of the clear ones. And in my previous video, part 1, I gave some very clear passages of scripture that taught that you can in fact lose your salvation. Let me look at one of them again. It's the first one. If we look in Romans chapter 11, the first one I used in my previous video, Romans chapter 11. Let's look there together. Verse 19, Romans 11 verse 19. They will say then that branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold therefore the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell severity, but toward thee goodness. If thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou too shalt be cut off. Now immediately here, the Eternal Security Advocate's going to argue that the Jews that were broken off were never believers, and so therefore these Gentiles that are being broken off are not believers either. There's a big problem with that. The Jews were grafted into the olive tree here by birth. They weren't even grafted, they were in the olive tree by birth. But these Gentiles are grafted in through faith. The only way the Gentiles can be in the olive tree is through faith, and you cannot be cut off from something that you were never grafted into in the first place. So it's clear that Paul is warning Gentiles who have been grafted into the olive tree, which is a representation of the covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Gentiles have been grafted into that through faith, and Paul was warning them that they could be cut off. I think that we need to read the unclear passages in light of these very clear ones so that we can have a proper, clear, biblical understanding of what the Bible teaches about whether or not you can lose your salvation. Now stay tuned, subscribe this video, watch the first one, and I'll see you in the next one.